So what do Santa, the Tooth Fairy, and God all have in common? Well, according to my guest today, the answer to that is that none of them exist. Is there enough compelling evidence to believe in God? Or is it really just a fairy tale? Well, those are the type of things we'll be talking about today with me, John Christie. So my guest today, well, he's an atheist and an author, and his book is titled No Santa, No Tooth Fairy, No God, The Need to Challenge Faith in America. And his name is Michael Spry, and let's welcome him. Michael, welcome.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me on.
So is it, first, do I call you Mike or Michael, or does it not matter?
Whichever you're most comfortable with.
Okay. I may go between the two, but I'll try to pick one and stick with it.
I would like to point out right off that while the title of the book seems very absolutist in terms of, no Santa, no Tooth Fairy, no God, that's basically the title of one chapter in the book, and was used for the book. I don't make absolute claims about the existence of anything. My perspective is more in line with doubt and claiming that there is not sufficient evidence or logic for me to conclude that there is a God. That's one of the types of atheism, what I call non-absolute atheism. Some people call it weak, which I don't particularly care for.
No, I wouldn't say weak. I've heard that as soft atheism. Is that a fair description?
Some call it negative versus positive or strong, which is the absolute variety. And I find those terms to be very value-laden, where absolute versus non-absolute is really more descriptive of the two perspectives.
Okay.
And I would guess, at least, I don't think there are any studies on this, but I tend to think that the vast majority of atheists are of the non-absolute variety.
Well,
that would include many people who call themselves agnostics, but are really using the term inaccurately.
Right. Okay, so now, since you've brought that up, one of the things I noticed in filming my movie, My Week in Atheism, and this was over about a year, possibly even a little longer than that, of total time that I'd spent out there in the field, per se, with atheists, and it was on and off throughout the year. But anyway, the background conversations that had happened, I would tend to find that if talking long enough in a conversation, especially when it was off camera or something, majority of people that I would talk to would eventually get to some level of, well, I don't know, maybe there's something that could be out there. And then it would usually wrap toward, but it's definitely not a God like you believe in God, or the Christian idea of a God, or, but that they weren't absolute, I guess is the way I would say it. It wasn't that they were saying, yeah, there's possibility that I believe in something. It was more that they were saying, I really don't know, but it's within the realm of possibility that could be something out there, but it's nothing that we've defined to this point. Would you say that's fair?
I think pretty much. I think it's more along the line of a lot of us feeling that anything is possible. You can look at fairies, for example. They're possible, but I really don't think they exist. But I'm not going to proclaim in any sort of absolute terms that there is no God. There are atheists who would say that. I tend to think they're in the minority. But, proving, well, The agnostic position, as it's really defined, and that came out of Thomas Huxley, is that it is impossible to either prove or disprove the existence of a God.
That's right.
And a lot of people think that agnosticism is basically not believing, but not being absolute about it. A lot of non-believers stay away from the label of atheist, um, in part because there's so much hostility directed toward it, but also for a long time, dictionaries carried the definition of atheism under the banner of absolutely denying any possibility of God. That's not the case now. If you look at just about any dictionary, it will have that definition because there are atheists who are absolutists, but it also will talk about atheism in terms of disbelief, doubt.
Yeah. So, okay, so with that, let's back up a little bit to how you got to where you are today. You know, in your book, you do mention that you came from a Christian background originally.
Yes, I did.
So why don't you give us a little bit of that history and bring us up
Sure.
to the book?
I mean, from some of my youngest memories, I can remember going to church as a kid and, winning a copy of the New Testament at Sunday school and that sort of thing. That was in a Methodist church. Later on, both of my parents were believers, especially my mom. And later on, we went to a Baptist church for a while. The minister one day said something that angered my father, basically claiming that, if you weren't a Baptist, you weren't a genuine believer, and he did not appreciate that level of judgment, and he never went back there. Later on in my high school years, I attended a Lutheran church with a very close friend of mine and did that for many Sundays, probably over a good year and a half or 2 years. But there was a key point in my senior year in high school, and it was really a silly thing. I had all these curses going in my head during a basketball game that I wanted to hurl at the other team.
Curses as in swears, not
Yeah, swear
okay,
words,
right.
and
Yep.
and there was this fear within me that God might make my team lose if I thought such thoughts. And at a certain point in my head, I thought, God must be a real jerk if he, expects me to go through such torment over
Right.
this. And, theologically, I don't know, maybe he would make my team lose for that. The significant thing about that moment for me was it was the first time that I started asking questions about the nature of God. And that process continued over about the next year and a half until, and I looked at, if people believe this about God, well, what does that say about God? Is this being something that I would want to worship? And you get into things about human misery and tragedy and disease and all this kind of stuff.
Sure.
The kind of thing that's usually excused with mysterious ways. But I finally reached a point where I remember one day I was at Michigan State University, my first year there, and I just looked within and said, I don't believe anymore. And from that point on, I walked away from it. At the time, and for a long time, I had an attitude, different strokes for different folks. I don't know everything. I may be wrong, but from what I can see, the considerations I'm looking at now, I really don't believe anymore. Now, from that point, it didn't stop there. That was during the countercultural era, for one thing, when many people were questioning everything. As I often say, nothing was sacred, not even the sacred. And many of us questioned our religious beliefs. And, there was a lot of open discussion about that sort of thing. And a lot of us walked away from religion. Um, but so there were, the kind of discussions that happened between people back then. A very pivotal experience for me was taking a course in cultural anthropology, where you look at the nature of human cultures and the things that are very common within cultures, things that are distinctive among them. You look at primitive cultures versus, more modern societies and whatnot. And one of the cultural universals is religion. Now, religion as defined in cultural anthropology is different than what a lot of people would think of. It's not um, based on belief in a god or gods. It's actually belief in the supernatural, belief that there are things beyond physical causes that impact upon a society.
Right.
That would include, having relatives in the afterlife, things like curses and hexes and
Magic and
that sort of thing.
superstitions.
Right, right.
Right. Yes.
So that is the definition of religion as it's looked at in cultural anthropology. Now, it just so happens that most cultures do believe in gods. And I use that plurally because the most common um, orientation, certainly in the more primitive cultures, is polytheism. They believe in many gods. And those gods serve a purpose. These people don't have science. They don't have means of understanding the things around them in any sort of tangible way. So they create gods within their minds, whether it's one person bringing it up and other people, signing on to that or whatever, but they cover virtually every phase of existence. There's usually a sun god and a moon god and, a rain god, god of fertility, god of the underworld. But it gets right down into very trivial sorts of things like, the Aztecs and Mayans had things like the god of howler monkeys and turtles and
Right.
fish, because it's a very natural human tendency
And this is
to,
the way to explain the world around
right,
them. Right.
right. Um, and it's a very natural human tendency to look at things you don't understand or things in general, things that happen around you, as having to be brought about by some being, whether it's somebody else in your culture or, in this case, a metaphysical sorts of beings who would impact upon things that you don't understand otherwise.
So let me jump in there for a moment, and then I'll let you
Sure.
continue on. But just to talk about a couple of these points you had mentioned, the first being that I always find interesting is that questioning phase, and I notice this a lot. I notice these patterns amongst atheists, and not just atheists, but anyone really that has ever given much thought into their religion. And I'm going to try to focus within Christianity because that's what I know
Sure.
best. That's what I am. So I would say, friends and people I grew up with, their belief in Christianity. They go through. There's always this initial questioning phase, and whether it's young in physical age or young in their spiritual, from when they were converted, I would say, because some people don't really enter into a real strong religious belief until their 20s or 30s. But it's usually, at some point in their walk, they start to have these questions. And there's usually some sort of trigger to it, whether it be the passing of a loved one, whether it be swearing at a basketball game, whether it be some injustice they feel done in the world or to them, or a pastor who had an affair and went against everything that he preaches, whatever it may be. Rightly so, it causes us to start questioning. I've always been fascinated with that because, I went through I would say several questioning periods, but my strongest being after I had already done 2 years in Bible college and got an associate's degree in practical theology, and I had been born again Christian, from the age of 12, and now I'm somewhere in my late 20s, and I start having these questions, and they didn't necessarily come from any real hard difficulty in life. It just kind of came through life in general, and I was kind of, I guess, in that coming of age where you're transitioning from a boy to a responsible adult. I had children at the time, very small children, married for maybe 5-6 years, something like that, and I just started really having that approach of, what is this God that we always talk about, we believe in? A lot of it seems like he's fickle. He himself is superstitious. He being a he. How do we know it's a he? Maybe it would be a she. Mm-hmm. And again, this is after, a couple of years in Bible college even. But I had known that up to that point, while I always had a very inquisitive mind, I accepted a lot of stuff on face value. Mm-hmm. And when I went through that period of time, the interesting thing from my perspective was I started looking at atheism. I never really can say that I was becoming an atheist or I was losing my belief in God. I was kind of looking toward atheism to say, give me your best shot. Give me some, I want the best arguments. I want to know what's out there and why do people not believe in God? And I really, I started absorbing Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and mm-hmm. Sam Harris. And this probably went on in my life over a good, I'm going to say about 8 years of time, maybe a little bit less than that, where I never would say, I ever lost my faith, but I was looking for something to, I don't know if I should say I was looking for something to convince me, but I was just looking for what was the best thing out there. And I kept feeling like all these arguments just kept falling short. What would start out as very claims that would say that they were very scientific in their approach ended up really becoming emotional. And the more I would read and the more I would look into them, God Delusion by Dawkins, it's very much an emotional appeal more than it's anything scientific. And that being from a scientist. So while I get that, I'm always fascinated because my journey into looking into atheism more and more never felt satisfactory in the answers. And then when I, for me, and when I really started going wholeheartedly into understanding not just the Bible, but theology throughout the ages, really focusing on since Christ, all the early church fathers to today, and reading beyond the Bible and all this, why we believe the way we believe and all the creeds and what they mean and what all of this has to say about the philosophy of God, theology, is when I really became wholeheartedly convinced that Christianity is the way. And C.S. Lewis puts it, it's one of my favorite quotes, that I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun, not because I can see it, but because by it I see everything else clearly. And that's kind of my perspective to it. The second point to that I thought was interesting that I wanted to mention is, first, I do notice, similar with you as in so many people that I've talked to, the slow decline into lack of faith or non-belief, atheism, whatever we want to call it. It's very, I can't say I've ever met an atheist that ever said, my mother died and I stopped believing in God the next day. And a lot of, I think, Christians tend to believe that's the way it is. There must have been something in your life. And I personally haven't seen that. I see there's many things, little things that caused doubt, questioning, objections over long periods of time that were either never answered or, similar to what I said, the answers that were given were not satisfactory. and
If I can
led those
stop you
people.
there just
Go right ahead.
momentarily, one of the things that upsets atheists is that people tend to look upon us as defective, that something had to go wrong to account for our disbelief.
Right.
And that's not true. I mean, it can be, but many of us feel as though we are taking a very rational journey through the various and sundry things we process in our minds.
Well, yeah, and similar, I mean, even with conversion into Christianity, there are some people that are born into it and never question it. There are some people that go through some sort of horrific event in life that turns them toward God and toward Christianity. There are those who spend a lifetime, 20 or so years of drugs and alcohol and just all kinds of destructive patterns, and then they, in some cases, overnight lose their addiction to their drug or their alcohol, and it's through salvation, and it converts them instantly. So to try to put people, whether it's atheist or Christian, in any one box that this is the way it happens, I think is it's naive. It's unfair,
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a whole spectrum of what it takes to convert, whether it's toward belief or away from it. Either way. The other thing you were mentioning that I thought was interesting, and I know you talk a little bit about this in your book as well, was the anthropology study. Because that was one of the other things too for me when I went back to college to continue on and get my bachelor's degree. I took several different anthropology classes and fascinated by them. One, in fact, being kind of beyond the cultural anthropology. It was called Magic, Witchcraft, and Religion. And it was all studies in mostly tribal groups, the superstitions they have, and everything we've learned about humans since recorded history, leaning toward we've never found a tribe, a people group, a civilization of any sort that has not had, whether we want to say a god, a religion, a spirituality, something to that extent. They all believe in higher power, something greater than them, which I've always thought is an amazing, to me, an amazing testimony to there being proof that there is a God that exists.
I would disagree with you there.
And why would that be? Why would you disagree?
I don't think that it necessarily implies the existence of a God. I think it's more an indication of a human inability to conceive of things without there being some outside will exerted upon them.
But the question of that would be, why would we feel that way? For example, eternity, the afterlife. There's nothing within the natural scope of our life, of existence, that would tell us there would be an eternity. Everything we see around us dies, whether it's the trees, the animals, our loved ones. We should
But what
be...
there is a common fear of death. And the afterlife helps address those fears by giving us a continuity beyond our mortality on earth. And there is a desperate longing among human beings to have a longer life than we may be granted on earth.
But that's the question to it, is that we have this, I'm going to claim that we have this innate desire for not death, for eternity. Like we can't accept it. We don't accept that death is the end. As much as we may want to say that, we long for more, for better, for other. And it's almost as if we're saying we're longing for otherworldly. We're longing for something greater than, and there's no real reason why we should. We should be excited and comfortable with the fact that we have this existence now, and however we got here, we are here, and we accept it and embrace it. And when it's over, it's over.
Oh, it's very difficult for people to accept that. It engenders anxiety, fear.
Yeah.
The thought that suddenly you're just not going to exist anymore. Most of us want to have a tomorrow, want to have another day, another week, another month, another year, and onward. We're not anxious. Well, there are people who are suicidal, and they do want to end their lives short. But most of us want to go on living as long as we, have our health and we're not in pain. We're not suffering so much that life is unbearable.
Right.
But from an early stage, I can remember as a child just being terrified by the prospect of death. You know, I don't, I could talk a lot about probability, not just probabilities we can calculate, but relative probabilities that involve complexities and whatnot. What is the more simple answer here? That there's some sort of magical inspiration that's placed in each one of us, or that human beings are so anxious about death that just as they invent gods about all manner of complexities in life, they would also invent an afterlife which would salve those fears, which would give them more comfort that there will be a tomorrow beyond what they experience on earth.
And I think the deeper view in that, and not to make this about C.S. Lewis, but the very quotable C.S. Lewis refers to this as hunger. And he says, the reason why we have hunger inside of us is because we know we need food. We know there is food. We know that if we have that food and we eat it, it satisfies that hunger. We know this is not a dream we have. This is not, fiction of any sort. It's very much a reality. And this desire for the afterlife is very much the same thing. We desire it because it is a reality, and we innately know that. Our soul is aware of this eternal existence, and that's what we long for, this afterlife.
I don't think you can liken it to physical hunger at all. Now, recognize much of my background is psychology. That's what I got my degree in. And I'm well attuned to how fears and anxieties propel human behavior and belief, much of which can be irrational. You talked earlier about, that you're looking at religion pretty much was within the framework of Christianity. When I studied anthropology, and even before that, I think I looked at this, but certainly with that and with my background in psychology and other social sciences, I tended to look at theology more as a process. How did this evolve from the nature of humankind? Going back, to the most primitive human life forms that came into existence. It's not like one day somebody wakes up and says, I'm going to invent a religion. It's a very gradual process. And what anthropology, it doesn't show us absolutely. It's possible that, primitive people were very different, thousands of years ago than the more recent primitive cultures that have been studied. But in all likelihood, there's probably some similarities because we are dealing with human beings. And, in the historical record, polytheism is almost universal with primitive cultures. It takes a long time before monotheism takes over with the fading of other, lesser gods and whatnot, and people focusing on, one God among the many in their culture until finally they let go of all of that. But if we look at all of the gods that have been conjured by mankind, I don't think you're going to argue with me that, the howler monkey god probably existed, but it existed in people's minds. And what is it about Yahweh, the God of Christianity, Islam, Judaism? What is there about belief in that God as it evolved through the history of mankind that makes Yahweh different than all the other gods.
Well, so now that's interesting, the perspective you take with it, because I find myself often in talking with people saying there's a lot I agree with you, but and then it's always these this 80% I agree with and this 20%, boy, is that a big deal difference. And so while I agree about the polytheism, and it's clear, I mean, if you study human history, anthropology of any sort, yes, and they were polytheism was the go-to belief system amongst vast majority of the world. In fact, it isn't even until Judaism that we really see this monotheistic God. Even, well, let's leave it at that for now, because I don't want to be sidetracked. Anyway,
Okay.
So with this polytheism, to me, that is the evidence of man looking for God, because it's man saying, I need to make excuses. I need to explain why that lightning, that fire came from the sky and burned my village. I need to explain, what these things were. And again, just as we were talking about longing for the afterlife, the other point of proof that I use for God's existence is that longing for justice. Justice being the equitable treatment. So saying, why did that fire come from the sky and burn my village? Well, there must be a reason, and that reason must be something bad happened. Somebody did something to upset a supernatural entity or whatever, which is, again, that innate longing we have for afterlife and that longing we have for justice. Those are two clear desires that I see that are in us from the beginning of mankind, and we're struggling to
But then we run into the rise of science. That's what ultimately did away with Greek. It's now called Greek mythology. It was Greek theology. And the early Greek scientists began to figure out physical causes for a lot of these things that had created wonder among human beings.
Absolutely.
And in particular, I think it was Thales who found patterns of weather affecting, crop growth and whatnot. And, as these types of explanations, rose to the surface, well, then a lot of the need for the theology was done away with. There were always realms where people could not understand, why certain things happened. And that largely is what maintained the drive for religion in human beings, that insecurity, that lack of knowledge. And science still has not supplanted every last drop of wonderment by a long shot.
Well, and the interesting thing about that is, while the Greeks did begin to philosophize away these gods, Socrates being labeled as an atheist for his rejection of the gods and the fact that, they're coming down and impregnating humans and burning villages and causing wars between all these type of things as explanations. What they did do, though, was they gave us a finer understanding of this innate knowledge we have of the universe. And the Greeks called this the logos. And Plato, refers to the good. But this was that higher power that's not necessarily a man in the sky with a gray beard throwing lightning bolts, but it's a wisdom, it's a knowledge, it's an intelligence that the universe has. That is where we get our mathematics from. It's where we get our logic from, logos being logic. It's where we get our sense of eternity. It's where we get our sense of justice. Is there a thing called justice? And this is what they referred to as the logos. So while they did begin to throw away these mythological gods, they very much held to the logos. And that's precisely where the Gospel of John picks up, it starts from and saying, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And he gets to the point of saying, and that Logos was a man named Jesus Christ who came on the earth. But they never abandoned that idea. They brought us into a greater understanding of that.
See, I would not put it in terms of an inherent wisdom in the universe. I think it's more natural laws, that there is lawful behavior, if you will, in the physical universe. And, you know, a good deal of the science, certainly in the last several centuries, has been trying to come to terms with what those physical laws are.
Well,
I think any inherent wisdom in logic is the nature of logic itself, the nature of reasoning itself, what makes things true or false. One of the things I studied at Michigan State University, and I'm not proud of the fact that I ducked studying a foreign language, but what I did do was I took a year-long sequence in formal logic, and it's pretty much Boolean algebra, how you can formalize arguments in terms of variables and whatnot. Not that you are likely to do that a whole lot in life, formalize arguments, but you realize that it can be done. And when you study logic, it helps to put a discipline within you in considering arguments and identifying what things are, truly necessary or not. And interestingly, the last quarter, it was a 3-quarter sequence. They taught a different form of logic in that quarter every year. And the year I was there, it was modal logic, which things are not just true or false, but they're true in some possible worlds, all possible worlds, or no possible world. So it was kind of esoteric. But I would say logic is logic. The nature of truth. And it's not, I've also studied statistics and probability. I would say, from the consciousness of mankind, it's less a matter of truth or falsity versus probability and improbability.
Okay, so let me ask it this way then. Would you agree that 1 + 1 = 2, or the logic of A equals A does not equal non-A, that reasoning, that logic exists without us knowing it? It's before we knew it. We didn't make this up and it fit our universe. We discovered this. It's a difference between invention and discovery, and we discovered it. Would you agree with that? I'm not trying to trick you into anything. I'm just
well, it's a really hair-splitting question. I mean, you could conceivably say that before there was life, that these principles still would have held. And
I would definitely say that. I would agree with that.
Discovering them is more discovering the essence of truth or apparent truth, rather than discovering a wisdom in terms of something that has been taught, something that has been imposed upon the universe. Again, that willful action of something making it true versus the nature of reality in and of itself.
Okay, so if I were to replace my word of wisdom with intelligence, being that, we base our understanding of intelligence on logic, on mathematics, reasoning. These are the things that we determine whether someone is intelligent or not. So these things being a basis of intelligence in the universe, it seems to me, and this is where I'd like you to explain from your perspective how I'm wrong, I guess, or incorrect. But it seems to me that intelligence is a binary option. It's either that intelligence is a product of a mindless material, matter, or it's a product of pre-existent intelligence. Thus, I would say a creator.
I can't put it in terms of intelligence at all. and part of that comes out of my background in psychology, where there's a focus on intelligence and what is intelligence, and it's more relative states between human minds and what they understand, and there's a lot of controversy over intelligence testing, and whether we're truly zeroing in on intelligence or not. I see that as a human trait rather than something that's imposed or something that exists within the universe. Now, knowledge of I guess reality is what I would see it as, the reality of lawful behavior. Mathematics, in some ways, it's humans discovering ways that work to quantify things that happen within the universe, and it's not arbitrary. It's of the nature of reality.
Okay. So in this realm that we're talking now, this is the realm where I see God. This is, not part of the natural, but part of the supernatural, the transcendence. It's not part of matter and material. It's beyond that. It's, again, the logic, the reason, mathematics, these things in the universe that we say, that science takes as axioms, that we base all of our science on these given, self-evident, known axioms. And then from there, we go out and we discover the world and how things work, and that, certain things happen and don't happen, applied system of science.
I would not accept that at all. I don't see those things as at all. Well, that, math and,
logic.
lawful, the logic, I don't see that as supernatural in the least. It's part of the natural state of the universe. It's an outgrowth of the nature.
How?
We find out.
Explain that to me, because that's confusing me.
Much of science looks at the nature of the universe, what laws we can try to figure out. The law of gravity, for instance, we don't even yet know exactly how it operates, but we find evidence out there that is consistent with the idea that gravity is a matter of attraction between relative masses, that the greater the mass, the more the gravitational force. But
all of that is the foundation of the mathematics. So gravity,
mathematics is an outgrowth of the reality of the nature of things.
But the numbers, the mathematics themselves are immaterial. They're not material. They 1 + 1 would still equal 2 if the universe didn't exist. Otherwise, we would only be able to depend on that in this universe, and in another universe, 1 + 1 may equal 5.
Well, mathematics wouldn't have any application whatsoever if there was not a universe.
Well, it would not have an application, but it doesn't mean that it wouldn't exist, as meaning it didn't begin at the Big Bang. It necessitated.
I don't think the
Big Bang.
universe began at the Big Bang.
Well, either one. If you believe in a multiverse, whenever the first multiverse popped, it was necessary at that point for it to occur.
That's an unanswerable hypothetical. Mankind cannot possibly know the nature of any beginnings. What started it all? There is no way that is accessible to the human brain.
Well, and I agree with that. I mean, how do we know that? But what we can look at is this is why I had the statement about intelligence, because what is more rational or more believable to believe that the intelligence that we're talking about, or the mathematics, that those things come from immaterial, mindless matter, or that it comes from a source of intelligence? And to me, everything we know in our world, in our life, screams that it has to come from intelligence. Intelligence only begets intelligence. We have nothing that we could point to say it just.
Well, the intelligence derives what the nature of things is. The fact that there are things to count gives birth to mathematics as a way of dealing with that reality.
But again, okay, I get that from that perspective, but again, we're not birthing it. We're not inventing it. We're discovering it. There's no mathematical formula that we have invented. We've discovered them. We've very, very similar to, let me back up 1 second and say this. I'm not a scientist. So I'm fascinated more along the lines of the philosophy of science, the method. My only formal studying in any science of any sort would be in textual criticism or hermeneutics, the biblical studies, exegetical studies, which are considered, I guess, an applied science. But I'm not a scientist, number one, so I'm not going to try to defend the second law of thermodynamics or something, because I don't know what I'm talking about. I've heard people say it, and I think that's one area a lot of times Christians can get overzealous in believing because they've read a book or two. Now they can talk to high level science, and I'm not going to claim that. So first I'll say that, but these are the questions of science, the philosophy of it that I look at and struggle with. So with that being said, that's where, when it gets into this realm, I look at this and I say, the best I can do is try to make sense of the unknowing, the immaterial, by what I know. And everything we know, all causes have a first cause, a cause before them, I should say. All intelligence comes from an intelligent source. All justification comes from a standard of justice. Okay, why would you disagree? To what part specifically? I mean, probably all of it. But
that intelligence necessarily has to come from intelligence.
So explain to me then how that could not be.
Oh, okay. I mean, we can't know what the starting point of the universe is. It may be the Big Bang. It may be that we're in an oscillating universe that oscillates between expansion and contraction, which is what I tend to suspect. But we can't know what that starting point is. It's just beyond the range of possibility. But certainly one of the possibilities in the history of the universe is that, and we see this over and over again, that a complexity evolves from simplicity. The basic atom, whenever that came into existence, there's one proton, one neutron, one electron. That is the most common atom in the universe to the degree that we can detect it. It took a force of some sort, inadvertently, to make an atom go from one of each of those particles to having two. And that complexity, through chance encounters, interactions between atoms and whatnot, between masses, then leads to an element with three, and on and on and on. You generally find within the periodic table that the more complex the atomic structure, the more rare that atom is within the universe. Again, within our ability to detect those realities, and then we have this Big Bang, and the Earth develops out of whatever process of matter distribution and collisions and whatnot led to the existence of this planet. And then over the course of 1 billion years, chance encounters of chemistry and whatnot make it possible so that some little bit of organic matter can reproduce its pattern over and over and over again. And that was probably done via the mechanism of RNA.
Okay,
and
let me.
that complexity then expands over the next 4.5 billion years, 3.5 billion years,
Mm-hmm.
and through the process of evolutionary development, we eventually build up to far more complex life forms.
And I get that, and I do believe the process of complexity comes from simplicity, and I'm one who I believe in evolution. I don't believe or I haven't been convinced, I would say, that all life has come from one single-celled organism, that it all branched from there. But I do believe that there is, I do believe in the process of evolution. I think, that's accurate. We see it. I'm just not convinced that it's what's caused the diversity of life and everything to this point today. That being said, I'm also what you would classify as an old earth creationist. I'm a creationist because I do believe that God created all things. The process in which he created all things is what I'm still learning. Whether it was literally he spoke, I do believe that he spoke things into existence, but were they into the existence of the form that we have today or 6,000 years ago? Or was it in the form it was millions or billions, however old, before? I tend to lean towards, again, based on the information that I've gathered, reading, studying, anything to whatever level I have, that the earth seems like it is old. It doesn't just look old. It seems like it is old. That the universe seems like it is old. It doesn't just look old. Light takes a certain amount of time to travel. The universe is so big, we could somewhat extrapolate the age from there. All these things. That makes sense to me. That doesn't challenge Genesis 1, in my opinion. That doesn't attack the Bible. And no, I see it as that seems to make sense according to the universe as we study it. Now,
let me offer up this perspective for you. And again, part of my background is statistics and probability. Having a God in the picture, a willful being that can impact on, the state of the universe, the state of development of life on this planet or whatever, adds complexity to the equation. You have to have a being with enormous talents, enormous powers, not only to move planets around or stars or galaxies or whatever, but then to have the dexterity apparently to control, RNA, DNA, illnesses.
but that's where, right.
Whatever.
So let me say, so that's where I was getting to with that was, while I believe in the complexity from simplicity, the issue I have is where you're claiming the simplicity starts. That single atom is highly complex. That's not as simple as we would like it to believe. In fact, believing that atom to exist or pre-exist without any God is more complex than the answer of there being a God. Because again, I go back to that binary option of intelligence. Either it came from nothing or it came from intelligence. And I don't see how it can come from nothing.
That's not the only possibility.
What's the other?
I mean, it may not have come at all. The universe may have existed forever.
Well,
people use God as the default frequently for what they cannot understand. And I don't mean to insult you in any way, but is that a comment about the necessity for a God? Or is it a comment about our inability as individuals to imagine other alternatives.
Well, and I think you can look at it either way. I think it's fair to say that. I think you can, determine whether the glass is half full or half empty, and we could go back and forth about that. So where I'm comfortable having that argument being placed on the table between the theist and the atheist is that there's rational enough belief to believe in a initial cause, an intelligent initial cause, this God of some sort. Don't need to necessarily paint him right away as Yahweh specifically, but I'm happy with the transcendental entity God. That there's rational enough belief to believe that, as well as there's enough reasons for you to not believe that. And that goes back to there's no way to really prove or disprove God.
But here's one question you have to address. Where did God come from?
This is the beauty of God, because this is this is what's known as the necessity. He's a necessary being, because we must have an eternal entity. We must.
That's in order more necessary than matter coming into existence.
But there must have been something before the matter came into existence, is my point.
Yeah, but you're talking about a something that is extraordinarily complex.
It is, but we have an extraordinarily complex universe.
Probability shows us that the more complex something is, the less probable it is.
But we could look at our human body and say, I don't think anybody is going to argue that is highly complex.
Yes.
And no one is going to argue that it's not probable either. I think we agree it exists. So while I understand statistically that may be the case, the reality is our highly complex human anatomy does exist, despite the odds that it might, which to me, the fact that it exists is even more evidence that there needs to be something. And the analogy I was going to use about God being necessary is, it's kind of like without God, without something being the first cause, the initial eternal cause, it's kind of like trying to jump out of a bottomless pit. You can never jump because you can never hit the ground and start springboard from there. So if we don't have that eternal necessity of that being, then we really have nowhere to attribute anything being into existence. And the fact that we
not at the beginning.
the fact that we are in existence, we are here, there must be something logically preceding us that brought us here. That's an
assumption, but it's not
Aristotle's immovable mover. It's the unmovable mover that Aristotle had introduced us to. That there must be.
Here is the flaw. Here is the inherent flaw in what you're arguing. Okay, this God that you're conceiving of is a very complicated being who's got these extraordinary powers. Okay, let's say we can compartmentalize. He's got ability A to do this, and he's got ability B to do this, and ability C to do this, and power D to do that, etc., and so on. Each one of those traits has a probability for how likely it would be to come into existence within a being. And considering the kind of powers that you are talking about, those probabilities are very, very small.
Well, and so I'm not denying that they're miraculous.
Let me finish.
Go ahead.
Probability shows us that for a being to have all of those capabilities, mathematically, if we could determine those probabilities, would be the product of those odds, the product of those improbabilities, which takes it to the range of even more improbable likelihood. This is what gives rise to Occam's razor, that the simpler explanation tends to be the more likely answer. It is more probable because it involves a lot fewer discrete steps of improbability.
See, and that's where, first, I would agree. We're living in a miraculous existence. Nobody saw this coming, and somehow here we are. This, from the Christian perspective, this is the argument of fine tuning, and that's the evidence for there being God. You're absolutely right. I'm not even sure of what the ratio is, but the impossibility of any of this existing, yet it does. So to you, you're saying the Occam's razor, you're applying that to this highly complex God, and you're saying that it's more likely that there was a simplistic answer, yet what I'm referring back to again in that is the most simplistic you can give me is still more complex than God, meaning to say that there was absolutely nothingness, not nothing as in others have tried to redefine it where there's actually mathematics existing or there is laws of physics existing. No, those are reliant upon there being something before them. So there has to be absolute nothingness, and then there is. For there not to be and then is much more. You can't explain it. We've already established that, and we both agree that we can't explain that because that is so complex. It's mind-boggling that there could be
your perspective is revealing the human tendency to feel that there has to be something before existence, and that is a question that is impossible to resolve.
But it
does not require the existence of a very complex being. How did that being come into existence? Did it evolve? And if it requires a complex being for all of this stuff to happen, then that's a whole range of low probability supposed realities that has to predate the simplicity that can otherwise explain the evolution of the universe.
So the God particle, the Higgs boson, before we...
That's not the God part. That's what some people...
Right, that's what they called it. Right, I understand. Yeah. I was using that as the nomenclature. The common phrase of it is the God particle.
Popularized.
Right, popularized. But so that, the Higgs boson, we didn't know it to exist. We couldn't find it. We could logically have said it's not real. It's a made-up theory. Just like I would say my belief in God would be a theory, or my evidence of God would be a theory. However, we believe so strongly in the logic and the reasoning that surrounded that theory that despite the fact of it not manifest or not being visible or being known to us, we continued to seek it because we knew it had to be there. This is that discovery. This is what a lot of science has been built around, is the understanding that the universe is something to be discovered. It has a basis of intelligence. It has something that we can learn from it. It's not just random and chaotic and just lost. It is something of purpose. It is something that guides us. There's natural laws, but they're laws.
But the Higgs boson particle did not have to be there.
Right,
it
did not.
Theorized because of behavior of matter.
Right.
And Higgs boson theorized that if this particle existed, that it could explain the behavior of things. And then they had to find experimental techniques, which were very demanding, in order to try to find this particle.
But don't you see where I'm going with that? That
no.
Based on that, based on what you just said, that it was theorized because of the behavior of material, it had to be. And that's what I'm saying. Because of everything
there could have been another explanation.
Could have, but we proved ourselves to be right. Could have, but we proved ourselves to be right because that was the most reasonable outcome that we could see. And so the same thing, when we see intelligence in in the universe, when we see causation and there must be a first cause, the most reasonable theory to me is that there was a first cause. There was an initial God. And while I can't fully prove it 100%, someday we're going to find that God particle, the real God particle, and we'll know for certain. But to me, it just logically leads to that.
That is not a necessity. It is a possibility, but it is not a necessity. There are alternative theses, and they may not make you feel comfortable. They may not explain it as simply in a way that appeals to you, but is that a question of what your need is in the way of something that appeals, or is it truly indicative of reality and what is necessary? You keep wanting to impose intelligence upon the nature of the universe. But it is matter. It is the matter within this universe. It's possible for other universes to exist in different ways, but within our universe, we have matter. We cannot know where it came from. We talk in terms of atomic particles. There are subatomic particles that probably predated the existence of atoms.
So would you...
The complexity came from the simplicity.
So are you open to the possibility then that in another universe, mathematics doesn't exist or is irrelevant or is non-existent?
Probably not, but that doesn't prove anything. The fact that there are things to count, things that interact with each other in lawful ways, gives rise to mathematics as a way to deal with these realities. You know, the mathematics isn't some tangible reality that exists independently of the reality itself.
But we treat it as if it is. I mean, we understand it to be truth. 1 plus 1 equals 2.
On the real truth, or is it a comment upon the weaknesses of human beings?
Well, I don't think it's the weaknesses. I think it's that's by which we govern truth. That things can be true and can be untrue is one of these prime examples of logic, and I would equate that to mathematics that we're talking about, is that something could be true or could not be true. If what you're saying is true, then I don't see how we can have any of these natural laws or these axioms. Okay, let me do this. I want to turn back to your book for a little bit, because I'm sure we could go round and round in circles about this for a while. And this is fun. I'm appreciating it a lot. I hope you're having a good time. I'm finding this stimulating and I'm enjoying it. But I do want to talk a little bit about your book before time gets away from us too much. In the early chapters, you compare God to Santa, the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, and you kind of...
That's not quite true.
Well, okay, I shouldn't say you compare them. Well, let me give my introduction to it, and then you can explain. But you give the scenarios of the scientific approach to what it would take for Santa to go through the world on Christmas Eve and deliver toys to everyone, what it would take for the Tooth Fairy to collect the tooths and give money, and where would they store them, and the Easter Bunny to go about its business every Easter. And so you use these fairy tales, these folklore, whatever analogies to kind of explain how impossible it is, and we can see that, and you do a very good job of showing that impossibility. And then you turn to God. Then you turn to God and you do it like with prayer and all the prayers that he must receive. It kind of reminds me of that movie, I think it was Jim Carrey, where he got to be God for a little bit, and he had all the prayers coming in, and then he had them in emails, and he just couldn't keep up with it, and how unlikely it would be that God could handle the duties of God in a reality. Mm-hmm. So what I'm interested in is, well, I guess first to that, feel free to start from there and re-explain any of that you feel necessary, or however you want to put it. But then put me in the mindset of why you went in that direction? Why did you feel that that was? Did you take up maybe 2 chapters of that, or was it just one? But
that was one chapter.
Okay, one chapter. But at least why you felt that that was something that you really wanted to draw attention to in the book?
Well, it's what I call a paradigm shift, which is to try to get people to think about things in a fresh way that gets them out of the track where they normally look at things. And again, I was not comparing God to, Santa or the Tooth Fairy. What I was trying to show there is that, here are these fanciful characters that, we deal with as children and whatnot. But it seems like we never contemplate the practical side to their backstories. We don't ask ourselves, well, gee, could Santa really visit all the houses in the world in one night? What would that look like? And I give the example that if Santa spent 30 seconds per household, he could serve, I think it was 2,400 houses.
You actually give some very complex mathematical formulas to this.
Yeah, I do. That was the complex formulas come into the number of simultaneous prayers that God would have to be entertaining at any point in time. And the formulas come in where I say, reader, you can figure out this for yourself, estimate for yourself. What percentage of Christians, for example, let's say God's only paying attention to Christians, and what percentage, or what's the duration of time on average that Christians would spend on prayer, and what percentage of Christians devote that kind of prayer on a daily basis. And you crank it through the mathematics, and you get an answer for the number of simultaneous prayers. And I think I gave a very conservative example of 30 seconds of prayer with 10% of the believers engaging in it, and it wound up to be like over 75,000 prayers at any particular point in time, assuming they're equally distributed throughout the day. And the reason for doing this was to it was to raise the notion of, here's these fanciful characters, and we can easily see their backstories as improbable when we look at the practical upshots for the mythology. But yet, most of us never put God's existence into practical terms and do the math on that, or question, how do human beings transmit this prayer? When Abraham supposedly had his conversation with Yahweh, well, God was up there in the sky. He was just on the other side of the clouds, and the stars were close at hand from what the average person thought, or at least from what we can gather at this point. When Jesus supposedly walked the earth, God was still up there in the sky. Well, our modern viewpoint is that the universe is pretty large. And, where's God in this universe? If he's halfway across the universe, well, how is it that prayerful thoughts get communicated almost instantaneously in real time, when any other form of communications, travels at light speed from what we can see? And, we're looking at billions of years in some cases for light to reach us from distant stars. How can we expect that sort of supernatural stuff to even work, let alone the human body is hardly built to transmit energy in any meaningful way other than, sound, conversation, that sort of thing. And what I was trying to portray is that diminishes the probability of at least a God as he, she, it is conceived of by the average person on this planet.
Okay. So
Doesn't disprove.
no, I know. But so where I first started thinking along those lines, the first thing that jumped out at me is just that you're trying to explain the supernatural within the natural, and whether or not supernatural exists is kind of what we're debating. But based on that assumption, if you're going to put God on trial, it seems like at least put him on trial for who he is. He's not natural. He's not at a certain altitude in the sky or in a certain location. He's supernatural. He's defined as being everywhere and all at once and all throughout all time. Now, that being said, one of the first things that I thought of that was an initial analogy on my part was love. And I thought, okay, well, I've got 3 children. And when I had my first child, I had a certain amount of love for him. And it pretty much would be, I would be fine saying it was all of my love. I mean, it was just everything. He was the greatest thing in the world. I couldn't believe it. And then I had my daughter. And I didn't split my love in half. It was an equal portion. And I loved them both with all of my love. Then I had my third child, my second son, and now I've got 2 boys, 1 girl. All of them I love equally with the most of all love that I could have. I have no idea where I keep getting all this love from. It's kind of like Jesus multiplying the loaves and fishes, but it just keeps showing up. And I look at that and I say, there's an example of what I would call supernatural. It's not within material. It's not within the natural world. It's something outside of the natural world.
Well, I have to disagree with you there. I mean, one of the things you learn about in psychology, at least when I got my degree, you had to take a class that dealt with the physiology of emotions and whatnot. Every emotion that you feel correlates to particular chemicals within the body.
I agree with that.
Constellations of chemicals. And
that's because
there's
we're
some debate
natural
among people as to whether I lost my train of thought here, but the degree to let me give you an example. That clinical depression, which is a common challenge for many people out there. It's a situation, we're not talking about the kind of depression that you feel when something makes you sad, some experience in your life, you go through a divorce or whatever, and you're very despondent. I mean, that's depression. But clinical depression occurs when your body produces the chemicals in abundance which are associated with sorrow, negative emotions. And the person who experiences this, it's like they are in a black hole where they can hardly remember ever being happy. It is just all consuming, just darkness within their lives. If you inject within a human body the chemicals that are associated with particular emotions, the person will experience those emotions.
Yeah, and I don't separate those emotions from it. This isn't a either or scenario where it's either a natural or it's a supernatural. It's an and also. It's natural and it's supernatural. In fact, this is how the supernatural affects or manifests in the natural.
I can't find
through
any
these
reason
things
whatsoever to believe in anything that is supernatural. You cannot prove that it exists.
Well, we've already talked about that, though, because, again, defining supernatural, not as wizards and magic potions, but defining supernatural of outside of the realm of the natural, outside of the material existence. And we've already said
that's the same as magic. And
well, no, that's what we've talked about. Logic, mathematics, those are those things. I would qualify it with love, justice.
They're not supernatural.
They're not natural. They're not within. You can't hold.
Sure they are.
You can't hold a one. You can hold a representation of a one.
One only has relevance if there's one object to count.
Well,
It's not something that is outside
but again,
the
that would
physical reality.
then that would say that if there was no existence of anything and any mind to conceive it, that one would not exist. And
Well,
again, that goes
mathematics would
back
have
to
no
we didn't.
relevance.
Well, it wouldn't have application to us because we are. But that's big difference between it not existing. It wouldn't have application, but it would still exist. Otherwise, we've invented this, we've created this, and we could change it, but we definitely cannot
No,
change it.
because the mathematics grows out of the nature of reality.
Well, we're getting back to our other
Yeah, we're
conversation,
counting
so
angels.
I want to talk about the tooth fairy a little bit more. So okay, so that was my first part to that was the natural and the unnatural and the supernatural. I'm sorry, and the analogy of love and then in your book you and I just want to touch briefly on this part, but you go into I what would you call part two of the book, the solution or the response?
Well, it's a lot of things. It deals with the place of atheists in American society from a variety of different aspects. The first chapter in that section deals with the concept of separation of church and state and how it grows out of the golden rule, and that there are reasons to have a separation of church and state outside of any provisions for it within our Constitution, case law, what have you.
Okay, that part
Okay.
right there. Give me a little bit more of that. Define to me more the golden rule and how that comes from it, because I want to make sure I'm understanding that part exactly.
Okay, well, basically, the golden rule is treating people as you would want to be treated. And the reason that separation of church and state came into the process, into the Constitution, in the First Amendment, was out of concern that any religious entity would gain an advantage through governmental institutions, which would allow it to oppress other beliefs. And this also includes people who don't believe in any religion at all. And so there was much debate over the First Amendment. You know, I think people, and I say this in the book, I think a lot of people think that the constitutional process was everybody just getting together and having a glad old time and drinking champagne when it was all over. But there was a lot of infighting among our founding fathers. And the First Amendment language came down to conference committee between the Senate and the House. The Senate felt no harm, no foul. You know, if you're not showing favoritism toward a particular religion, that you ought to be able to do things with governmental resources to support religion. And the House said, no, that's not going to wash. Government needs to stay out of religion, and religion needs to stay out of government. You know, they each have their own provinces. And then there was debate over the language and how it would be, and it ultimately came down to this unfortunately vague language we had, which says Congress shall consider no law respecting the establishment of religion. Now, there's been some debate over what that meant, and actually that only tied the hands of the federal government. States were free to do whatever they wanted, although most passed similar language in their own constitutions. But James Madison, who was the principal wordsmith with respect to the First Amendment, made it abundantly clear later on that indeed they weren't just talking about state religions, they were talking about very small considerations. And the example was right after the Constitution was ratified and the Bill of Amendments was ratified, there was an effort to create chaplains for each house of Congress. And Madison was exasperated. It's like they didn't get it. They just passed this First Amendment and they didn't get it.
Right.
That he had no objection to there being chaplains of each house, only that taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for it.
Okay, so let me hold up there. So the foundation of our Constitution, what formed it, was our Declaration of Independence. I mean, that was when we stood up and said...
That led to it. The Declaration
right.
of Independence was a list of grievances
right.
against the king.
Right. And in that, obviously, it attributes the laws of nature and of nature's God. And then the famous line, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And then that are among them are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness.
When it came time to create the basis of law, that is when the Constitution came into being. The Declaration right. of Independence is not and never has been the basis of the law.
And I agree with that. I agree with that. But what I'm getting at with that is that this is the mindset that they had going into this. So it wasn't a mindset of, look, we basically, I would say it this way. This was the mindset of one nation under God. That it's because there is a God.
That language didn't even get...
No, I know that.
That came along in the 1950s.
Right, but this was... actually, Lincoln used it first in his... what was it, the Gettysburg Address? But that, even still, from the 50s under, I think it was Eisenhower, and Lincoln, it all comes back to this. That we believe that we can establish, and this goes to one of those axioms I was talking about earlier, justice in the universe, that all men are created equal because there is a God. If there is no God, there is no such thing as equality.
Well, that is what some founders believed, but there were many that did not. Thomas Jefferson was a deist.
Well, but we have, a deist, yes, but that's deist, still a theist.
That's a theism.
Right.
But okay, let's.
But even still, what I'm saying is,
though,
we felt it unanimously that.
No, I don't think you can say unanimous.
Well, we started as the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. So yes. They did feel as 13 states unanimously that this document represented them, and they all signed it at the bottom.
Represented their grievances against the king.
Well, but part of that was in defense that they were...
There were 11 years separating the Declaration of Independence from the Constitution. And early in that period, there were the Articles of Confederation, which didn't succeed very well, but even they only contained, I think, 2 references to a deity, and one was... wheresoever it hath pleaseth the great governor of the earth to blah, blah, blah. And then in the year of our Lord, and they had the date. Those were the only 2 references to religion
right.
within the Article of Confederation. Within the Constitution, the only reference was Article 6, which said there will be no tests of religion
belief.
holding
right.
public office.
And so the point I'm making, though, is that they didn't need to make those laws all about God or anything, because we already established that. We're created by God. That gives us equal rights, and as such, these are the laws we will abide by to make sure that we all have those rights.
You cannot legitimately assume that the Declaration of Independence was a preamble to the Constitution. I will not allow you to do that.
I don't see how you can. I honestly don't see how you can separate the two.
It would have been officially made part of the Constitution. It is not as though our founders were unaware that there were atheists within the
absolutely.
the colonies of the United States.
And that's exactly why we have the First Amendment. That's exactly the reason why. I'm not sure what you think I'm saying about that, but I'm not saying that they were establishing this nation as a Christian nation, that everybody must bow their knee to Jesus
I hope
Christ.
you're not
Absolutely
that
not.
it was necessarily created as a religious nation.
No, I'm assuming that it was established that we are due our rights as humans because there is a creator. And then what logically follows from that is law. Because once you have a higher authority, you now can have law. Without a greater authority, you can't have law. All you can have is anarchy.
No, that's incorrect. That is absolutely.
How is that incorrect?
Because believing in a God is not necessary to have morality. You can derive morality from the nature of human existence.
Okay,
there's what makes societies work better, principles of fairness, and fairness doesn't mean necessarily one thing. There's a whole lot of study that goes along with that. But that's what atheists do. We derive our own sense of ethics and morality. See, this is one of the things we have to deal with, and it's very frustrating. The people think that we cannot be moral people.
Yeah, and I'm not claiming
people.
that. I'm not claiming that. I think you might be assuming. It's a very important
point to make.
Yes.
That we can and do derive strong senses of morality. And
absolutely.
ethics.
And I even say that in the movie, I do mention, I say, not only do I believe that atheists can have high moral standards, I'm trying to quote myself and I can't even do that, but I think I say something like, I know many that do have even higher standards than some of the Christians that I know, or something along those lines. And so the reason, from my perspective, the reason why I say that is because while you do not need belief in God in order to have a moral standard, that's different than saying you do not need a God. You absolutely need a God to have that moral standard, but you believing in him, you do not have to have belief in him. And the reason I say you have to have him,
there doesn't need to be a God.
There does. It's again the necessity, because there is justice. If there is no God, there is no justice. And the Declaration establishes that.
Justice comes out of logic.
Well, the Declaration doesn't claim that, and they claim that it comes from God.
Again, the Declaration of Independence is not the preamble to the Constitution. It is not in the Constitution. They are separate documents for separate purposes.
Right.
There may be.
Well, and so with that, let me point to the point that I agree with you on that. So with that, with the Constitution, I believe that the First Amendment is exercised properly when the government is not telling individuals how they can and cannot worship, and the church is not telling the government how it can and cannot operate. Okay?
And if the church and religion is not using the machinery of government to impose its standards.
Well, see, that's where it gets
judgment
tricky.
Upon those who do not believe.
Okay, and so to a point, I would say if you're imposing that judgment upon those who do not believe, you're in violation of the First Amendment. However, we live in a democratic republic where we are allowed to vote.
No.
Oh, what part of that's no?
We're not in a democratic republic.
We're not.
We do not. We are in a constitutional republic. The United States.
We're given the democratic rights to vote.
Yeah.
No, it's not a true democracy. That's why I said a democratic republic.
No,
we elect our officials to represent us as a republic.
It is a constitutional republic. That is the
where we're given democratic right to vote elected officials. And
but see, some people believe that democracy gives majorities the right to run roughshod.
Yeah, it's not majority rule. Absolutely not.
Okay.
No, and that's why. That's to bring up a sore point to a lot of people. That's why we have an electoral college.
Well, no, that's not. Like we have an electoral college because of the distances between colonies where it was not practical.
Right.
Yeah.
and that could cause majority rule, high populated areas. Either way. So my
Yeah.
point being to that with the Constitution is, from the Christian perspective and what I read in your book, again, there's much that I'm in agreement with you on. I don't think we should force people into a Christian belief system in this government. I don't think we should, but that being said, I think we should allow the individuals to have as much freedom as they want to evangelize and do everything they need to do, which we have that freedom. I'm not saying that's threatened or taken away. That's why I'm doing this podcast. So my only point to that is, while I know that the Declaration is not in the Constitution, we can't deny that those are the two documents that, and you could include the Bill of Rights, which is, the Constitution Part
That's
B.
part of the Constitution.
Right. But those are the documents that shaped our country and its ideologies. And a large part of that is giving credit to the fact that, as we spoke about earlier, there is a God by which we can hold a standard of justice and say all men are equal. Without that God, I don't see how we can claim all men are equal.
Well, I would agree with that. The absolutes aren't there. But, you're almost talking as though, there was universal agreement that people in the colonies all thought that God created humankind, blah, 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 blah. You can't presume that everyone in the colonial United States necessarily supported all of the language within the Declaration of Independence.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, that's kind of how would we go back and prove that either way?
Getting bogged down here. You need to understand that the atheist perspective on this is, we don't want to see people using the Declaration of Independence as justification for infringing our rights as non-believers.
So let's do this. Let's try it on some practical exercises.
Okay.
So, a Christian company X, and they're a very large company. They're a global chain or a national chain, big. They employ, I don't know, let's say they employ 10,000 people, and with the birth control issue with the Hobby Lobby scenario right there, do you feel that Hobby Lobby is in their right to say we do not want to pay for birth control, or do you feel that the government should be forcing them to pay for birth control?
It's a very murky subject, and I don't know that you can justify either possibility in any sort of absolute terms. I have mixed feelings about it. Personally, I think healthcare should not be within the responsibility of businesses anyway. Okay. And if we in fact had universal health care, which is what I think we should have, then those issues would go away. They would be irrelevant.
Because the government would be paying for it, not the privatized company, right? Which then I guess would bring up the argument of tax dollars. But okay, so it doesn't sound like you're trying to eradicate religion or Christianity from our I don't want to say from our government, but from the public sphere. But what is it you would like to see? From the public
sphere, it depends on how you're portraying the public sphere. Is certainly putting resources of the government into in any way advancing religion. I have objections to that. A candidate saying that he's a Christian or Jew or whatever, that's fine. As long as that candidate also recognizes that we have citizens of other persuasions whose rights have to be respected as well. One of the immense frustrations among atheists is that historically this country has put itself behind one faction or another of religious practice. And that certainly was the case in the public schools for a long, long time. I can remember as an elementary school student in a public school, the Lord's Prayer was recited every morning. Now imagine you're an atheist parent. Do you want government institutions to be, when it's totally unnecessary, to put your child in the position where they may be judging you harshly at that point in their lives because you're not a believer?
Well, and I can be sympathetic to that.
Put ideas in their heads about that?
I mean, even
Pardon?
if I said I can be sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
Imagine if you were a 14-year-old Muslim.
Right.
You know, I mean, or, you know, there's lots of ways
Anything.
You can go with that. Right. So, yeah,
in fact,
you know, I'm for that.
The biggest objectors to the prayer in schools initially were people of the Catholic orientation, because the schools were dominated by Protestantism, and they could not get public funds to run their own schools, and that's what ultimately drove the development of parochial schools, was to break away from the Protestant influence in public schools. Well, that has evolved over time, and basically a lot of the evolution came through court cases where one or another disaffected group would take a case to the Supreme Court ultimately in order to get their concerns addressed. And, you know, that's where atheists are right now. For us to gain any remediation on any questions dealing with our rights, we almost always have to take it to a court, because legislatures are so, they tune us out because they cater to majorities.
Yeah. Well, the book is called No Santa, No Tooth Fairy, No God, The Need to Challenge Faith in America. And Michael, I really want to thank you for coming on and having this conversation.
I think we've had a very productive discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, I enjoy it.
Your listeners can understand that, yeah, atheists have to deal with some tough issues, and we can be frustrated and angry and emotional about them because we're struggling to be recognized properly. But we're not evil people. We're like everybody else.
Well, you can't be evil. If there's no God, there can't be an evil. So you can't be evil then. That's my little closing joke on it.
Some people who believe in a different God might think otherwise.
No, and you know, that's a good point. I mean, we fight against each other too much, and that's what I'm trying to do with this show is just have these discussions. We can disagree and we can get along, and we don't have to hate each other. We're all, you know, I always say we're all still going along our paths, and who's to say on either side whose minds may change in the future or whatever. You know, that's the reason we do this. So yeah,
thanks.
I agree. I don't find you as evil as I thought you were going to be, so that's good. No, I'm joking. That's a total joke.
My grandchildren love me.
So, Michael, how can people get in touch with you? Email or what's the best way?
I would use Atheists Are Us. There's no apostrophes in there, at charter.net.
Atheists Are Us.
Yeah, and it's not ARE, it's
R.
ATHEISTS R us at charter CHARTER.net.
Like the Toys R Us.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
So again, This has been another good show. Really having a good time doing these. And I hope you guys are liking it too. My name's John Christie, and you can reach me through my website as well. That is johnchristie.com. Let me know what you think of the show. I'm looking for feedback, so don't hesitate. I'm also looking for guests. So if you or someone you know wants to have a discussion like this on religious or spiritual beliefs, even non-beliefs as Michael and I did, well, get in touch with me and let's talk. Also, you can check out my documentary movie, My Week in Atheism. It's for free if you have an Amazon Prime account. And don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast. It's available on iTunes and Spreaker. You can just search for my name, John Christie, and it should come up. Again, I'd like to thank Michael Spry for coming on. The book is No Santa, No Fairy Tales. No Tooth Fairy, No God. No Santa, No Tooth Fairy, No God. You can find that on Amazon, and I will be talking to you guys soon. See you next week.